Hi, my name's Meg Hillier and I have the privilege of being chair of the Commonwealth Association of Public Accounts Committees, as well as chairing the UK Public Accounts Committee. I'm so sorry that I'm unable to be with you in Kuala Lumpur today. I always enjoy meeting colleagues around the Commonwealth to learn from you about what you're doing, how you're doing your job, and to share our experience from the UK. It's a really important job that we all do, and I don't need to tell you how examining how our taxpayers' money is spent by government is absolutely vital. In the UK, we hold all our meetings in public, and that very publicity, that transparency, keeps government on its toes. In the UK, the Public Accounts Committee is made up of 16 members of Parliament. I'm privileged that I've got members of 4 different parties: the main government party, the opposition party, and 2 of the smaller parties each have a single member on there. We're made up of a balance of the parties that are elected in a general election, and as chair, I am elected. I'm the second chair ever to have been elected in the UK. I was elected in 2015, and we can serve a maximum of 10 years or 2 parliamentary terms. I know this is very different to how many of you work, but I would urge you to consider looking at this as an option, and I know that my colleagues with you in Kuala Lumpur will be able to talk to you from their perspective about the relative advantages of doing this. It gives me a really strong independence because 650 members of Parliament in the UK have the chance to vote for me as their chair, whatever their party. So it's not an appointment made by government, it's not an appointment even made by the whips on the opposition party. So I have a strength and a longevity that supersedes a lot of other parliamentary offices. So not only do I have the privilege of doing it, but I do know that I'm not going to be easily got rid of. I can't just be moved on unless members have decided I'm not doing a good enough job. I have also introduced on my committee a formal role of deputy chair, partly learning from what some of you do around the world. We in the UK have a very peculiar system where we only have chairs of committees and no formal deputies. I felt this was wrong. I also felt it was not politically savvy not to be able to buy in the government party into some of the decisions we may have to make as a committee. And I found it incredibly helpful as chair to have as a supporter someone on my committee who's got good connections with the government party, who has a specific role. My current deputy, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, has been great at opening doors and dealing with little tricky issues where we have to sometimes resolve things and we need access to number 10 where the Prime Minister's based, or to government generally. I don't need to tell you how important our work is, as I've said. In the UK, our remit, when we were set up over 158 years ago, was to look at the economy, the efficiency and the effectiveness of taxpayers' spending. And I know that I'm privileged that I rarely have to consider or worry about dealing with corruption, and that for many countries across the Commonwealth, that's still a real concern. And as well as that, we also see a lot of waste. That's the biggest concern for me as chair of the Public Accounts Committee here. If we could add up every £1 million that the government wastes and spend that on something more positive, that would be a good thing. And I'm keen that we look at how we evaluate our work to assess how much money we're highlighting in waste, and actually, eventually, how our work is helping government save taxpayers' money to spend on more productive things. I know that in the sessions in Kuala Lumpur, you will be discussing how you evaluate your work, and I'm really keen to hear from my UK colleagues as they report back about what you're doing. Our aim is to have a long piece of research that looks about how our work has actually influenced change in government. We're quite a way off from delivering this. We haven't got all the answers, so I hope you have something that you can share with me. We've been pretty busy on the Public Accounts Committee in the UK over the last year, partly because we're 2 years into a parliament. Normally we have a new parliament set up through the Queen's speech, which is when the government outlines new policies every year. We've been going now for 2 years without a Queen's speech, which means we produced over 100 reports in that time. But it's not just the volume of reports that I consider a success. In some ways that is, because it shows the breadth of what we do. But the key thing for me is about follow-up. When we produce a report in the UK, our recommendations go to government for a response. They have to respond. And we also sometimes set them timeframes to come back on particular issues before the official response is due. When I became chair and began to read these responses, which we call the Treasury response, they were often very weak. Sometimes they'd say, "We agree with the committee," and then proceed to describe exactly how they didn't agree with the committee, and sometimes the other way round. So what we now do is look very closely at those government responses. Where they are weak or inadequate or just a bit unclear, we either write to the department for more information or, quite effectively, call the permanent secretary, that's the civil servant who is the head of that department, and the accounting officer, into our committee room in public to explain themselves. And we found that has been a very useful way of sharpening up their responses to our reports. We've also looked, of course, at lots of different subjects. Like you, we cover a wide range of issues. We don't have a separate committee in the UK that looks at infrastructure, so we cover a lot of that. I work closely with my sister committees that look at different departments, and we share that work amongst ourselves. But we will constantly be looking at the numbers and the project issues. And the regular themes that come out of the work we do are that government too often poorly specifies a contract in the first place, relying on data very often that is just not good enough. And very often, especially when it's outsourced, the private sector believes, because that is government data that they're getting, that it's correct. And they have now learnt the hard way that very often it's not. Secondly, once the contract has been let, government is very poor often at monitoring how it's going. And we've seen some shocking examples of where contractors have made money out of government when they shouldn't have done. In one case, it was a serious criminal action where the Ministry of Justice was being charged by an outside private company for prisoners who were tagged, even when some of those prisoners had died. So they were getting their data wrong, and government didn't have the ability to analyse that data. As a group of politicians, just like you, we are very keen to try and reflect the concerns of our constituents, the things that we see every day in our constituencies and here at our advice surgeries. So we've been raising a lot of concerns about funding in our health service and how well that's being managed. It's had a large injection of cash recently. We want to make sure that that's being spent well, and specifically on some of the issues where we've seen one-off funding over recent years. We've seen a real trend in the UK for government to take money out of the capital budget to use it on resource funding. We know that's not a sensible way to manage a budget. It gets them over the hurdle for 1 year or two, but it leaves a long-term legacy of underinvestment in equipment and buildings. So we're keeping a very close eye on that across the board. We've also been concerned about schools. We had introduced, in recent years, there's been a new system of schools introduced in the UK, which allows schools to be run directly from government, but run on the ground by a sponsor, a company, or even sometimes a group of individuals, maybe parents, who think that they can run a school that's different or better than the local schools run by the local municipal authority, our local councils. And we've seen a number of problems with those schools where those people really haven't had the expertise to run an educational establishment. And when things have gone wrong, guess who's had to pay? The UK taxpayer. I've had one recent example in my own constituency where I wasn't even informed that it was going very badly wrong until the intervention happened. And I had to go begging to the government for more taxpayers' money to bail out where the private company had failed. One of the concerns this raises for us is what happens when people make those mistakes. What sanctions do they face? In the case of schools in the UK, we have found that only 2 people have ever been told they can't be governors or trustees of a school charity again. So we're keen to tackle that. I'm quite taken with the model in Ghana, where if a public official wastes money, they have to pay it back. And if they want to contest that they should pay that back, they have to pay half up front before they go to court. When I mention that to public officials in the UK, they look a little pale, but some of them rub their hands in glee at the prospect that someone might actually be held accountable for that waste of money. They're just some of the examples, and it was a real shame that I can't be there to discuss with you in person what you're learning from it. But I wanted to, before I finish, just talk a little bit about how we work in the UK. I was on the committee for 4 years before I became chair, so I know what it's like to be a backbencher on quite a large committee, and I know some of you have much larger committees than we do. I was therefore very keen to make sure that backbenchers, when I became chair, had a real role. So we've taken to preparing very closely together, cross-party, in a team before a hearing. And we take it in turns to lead on a subject, a sort of lead member approach. So we'll have 2 or maybe 3, sometimes 4 members who are determined to get into depth with what the National Audit Office, our national audit body, has provided us with, but also do some independent research and crucially work together. So typically we'll meet about 10 days before the actual public hearing. We'll talk to the auditors who've done the study on a particular project or an issue. We'll cast our ideas around, challenge each other, think about what we want to get out of the hearing and see if there's anything more we need to do a good job with the officials, and discuss, of course, exactly who our witnesses are and how we need to work to get the best answers out of them. We all know what it's like when you've got those witnesses who never reveal anything, and we try and work out how we can get under their skin and get them to actually give us the answers that we need. So that's worked very well. I found it's been really great as chair for the morale of my committee. They feel very much a team. They have fed back to me that they feel very positive that when they put the effort in, they know they'll get their time in the room, their time publicly in front of their constituents to show that they're challenging the government. And at other times they'll come into the room and sit quietly and listen, sometimes passing a note rather than intervening themselves to the lead member, and sometimes being a listener so that they can hear when the lead member's not got quite the answer that they want, and they can chip in, and we'll do that pairing so that we have a listener as well as a questioner. And it also gives freedom for members not to always turn up to every single meeting. This is helped by the fact that we do one hearing on one subject pretty much, and those members though very much buy in to the writing of the report and the recall. And at the end of the hearing, again to make sure my members are bought in, we'll have a discussion about how it went, whether any issues that we think should be taken up outside of the committee room and outside of our report that perhaps don't quite fit a report but warrant further action, and who will do that, and very often that will be the lead member. And we discuss what we think our recommendations will be. So effectively, we're writing our report in the room at the end of the session. I then feel confident as chair that I'm reflecting the cross-party views of my committee. They then trust that I'm taking that on board and go ahead and let me get on with dealing with the writing and editing of that report, working with our drafters, including our excellent clerks. And then I know that I've got a report that's backed by the committee, but we avoid that endless and quite painful line-by-line approach to editing a report, which would double our workload for not much benefit. I'm not saying everyone should do it this way, I'm just sharing with you what we do. I've found it works for me as a chair. My backbenchers tell me it works for them. And it has been noticed in Whitehall, and they now try and find out who the lead members are. And they've admitted to me privately they're quite frightened of some of my colleagues, because once they're really in depth on a subject, that plus good questioning skills mean there's really nowhere for the civil servant to hide. And that's what we're all about. Not to get them, but to make sure that they tell us honestly as much as they can about the subject at hand. I was hoping to be there to learn from you. As I say, I will listen to my UK colleagues about this and about what you're doing in your countries. I think we've got huge opportunities, and I know that we're looking to share how we work as well as the subject matter more widely. As chair of the Commonwealth Association of Public Accounts Committees, I think we do need to have some sort of online network, and I know that you'll be talked through this by the CPA team. It's really important that we do share. When you just are elected to Parliament and you arrive on the Public Accounts Committee of your country, it's a daunting task. I remember being quite daunted, even though I had been an MP for a few years and even a minister. It was quite a big task to turn up to the Public Accounts Committee and feel that each time I had to be fully briefed on a subject and clever and no more than the civil servants. I now know differently, but we have ways of making it work so that we can get the best out of those civil servants. So thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to meeting you. If you're ever in London, please let me know, and I'd be delighted to meet you and learn your experiences as a member of the Public Accounts Committee.